and welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Danny Cannell, that's Bud Elliott, that's Tom Fernelli. I'm Chip Patterson coming to you live on CBS Sports Network. Lots to get to over the course of the next hour as we get you set for week 3 in the Big Ten. We will be breaking down an incredible opportunity for the Purdue Boilermakers as they will play host to Notre Dame on CBS, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We are also going to be looking at Wisconsin as they are going to be welcoming in the Alabama Crimson Tide, one of the biggest games of the week. But before we get to some of those big game breakdowns, gentlemen, I got my little prescription pad right here, okay? I got it all here in my handy pocket. Okay, we're gonna play Dr. Cover 3 here because we've got some teams in the Big Ten that took a couple losses over the weekend. And what I think our task is going to be is to figure out what went wrong and what is the path to getting better. So over the weekend, we had Michigan, of course, losing to Texas, very high profile loss. You had Iowa blowing a 13-0 lead at home in the Cy-Hawk Trophy game against Iowa State. Maryland, I mean, they had a touchdown lead with about 5 minutes to go. They end up giving up 2 scores in the final 5 minutes against Michigan State. And then Northwestern losing to Duke in double overtime. So let's begin with the Michigan Wolverines. And we'll probably spend most of our time here on Michigan and Iowa. Danny Cannell, with everything not being an acceptable answer, what went wrong for Michigan in this game against Texas?
The prescription is playing an easier team. I mean, they just went against an absolute juggernaut, but this does carry over somewhat from Fresno State, so you can't blame it all on the Texas Longhorns. They've got significant issues. I know a lot of people are going to dissect the quarterback because it's the most important position in the game, but we did discuss a lot of their issues across the board. The offensive line is still struggling to find its feet beneath them. They've got to come together quickly or else this team just is going to be a rebuild year. You know, you're looking at 8-4, potentially 9-3, so that you can give Davis Warren some time. You can give him a run game because I do think that's desperately what he needs, and they haven't been able to support him with that. Donovan Edwards has been missing in action pretty much. Mullings has stepped up a little bit more, but it just looks like there's a lot of pieces that are missing that they're trying to figure out as they search for an identity. And part of that does have to do with the quarterback position. Tom and I were talking earlier on CBS Sports HQ about the need to find your quarterback and stick with him. Like if you're going to go with Davis Warren, then stick with him, build an offense around him. If you want to go with Alex Orji, which I don't think is the answer, then build an offense around him. But find one and stick with it and start to build an identity because right now this team looks like it's still searching for all these answers.
Sorry, Danny. So my second opinion on this is that Dr. Danny's right. Ultimately, what they need is time and another offseason. They pretty clearly built this roster around the idea that Alex Orji was going to be the guy. They were going to have an 11-man run game, mash people, win low-scoring games. They did not get anybody in the transfer portal to come play receiver, right? This offense is not built to throw the ball. Their receivers are probably not top 2/3 in the Big Ten. They don't scare anybody. So if you want to go with the pocket passer, cool. It limits the run game a little bit. Colston Loveland's a great tight end, but these receivers, like Texas was like, that's all you got? Okay, so I think they just need time and another offseason. Right now, I ran my model. I have them 7-5 or 8-4 as the two most likely. So I'm slightly a little more pessimistic than Danny, but they can still win close games if the defense plays really well. I just don't really see any real hope for this offense improving a whole lot, with the exception of playing worse teams.
Yeah, as far as the 2024 season is concerned, I fear that whatever Michigan has, it's terminal to their college football playoff hopes, because what we saw in that game against Texas was they are just not at the same level of the teams that we look at and consider as conference title contenders, national title contenders. It's a complete and drastic difference from what we saw from Michigan the last 3 years, where even though the offense was never super exciting or super explosive, they were strong enough at the lines of scrimmage to beat up and ground opponents into dust. That's not the case with this team. Defensively, I still think they're one of the better units in the country. There's some question marks about what they're doing on that side of the ball. I've seen Mason Graham being put on the edge a few times. Not sure what the goal is there. They are very, very heavy with blitzing, which is nothing new for Wink Martindale, and I think that's going to be fine in 80% of their games when they're facing your typical college quarterback. But as we saw against Quinn Ewers in Texas, when you go against one of the best quarterbacks in the country, he doesn't care if you blitz him. He can still make plays happen, and he can still tear your secondary apart, because as great as Will Johnson is, the rest of that secondary is not Will Johnson. And I think we saw the prescription for other teams on that game. Attack the guy who isn't Will Johnson, and you might have success in the passing game against this Michigan defense.
Yeah, all these other Michigan defensive backs are going to be at the top of like the pass breakups list in the Big Ten, just because they're going to get targeted all the time. I will say that, to everyone's point, we can at least offer some short-term relief for the Michigan Wolverines. Hello, Arkansas State. Here's your short-term relief. You should feel better about yourself after Saturday. All right, Tom, what went wrong for Iowa in something that hasn't happened in nearly a decade, blowing a 13-point halftime lead, doing it at home, doing it to your biggest rival? How did the Hawkeyes start to put the pieces together? And I will say, for Iowa also, you play Troy, so you might be able to get the good vibes going in the right direction again. But there are bigger games ahead for the Hawkeyes. What went wrong and what can be fixed for Iowa?
I think they lost their balance. If you go back and watch the game, in the first half of the game against Iowa State, they were balanced on offense. They ran the ball 19 times. They threw the ball 17 times, and they took a 13-0 lead. Coming into the second half, they ran the ball 21 times and only threw it 11, so nearly a 2-to-1 ratio, and it becomes a lot easier to defend a team when you know what they're going to do most of the time, and we saw the offense really struggle. Now, I don't think it's just balance. I do think there are problems as far as the personnel is concerned. Maybe the wide receiver boom we saw in that first game against Illinois State, not quite as good as we'd hoped for, because they really struggled to get guys open against Iowa State. But I don't think that this is a terrible problem for Iowa. I still think that as long as they keep sticking to their identity, they're going to win more games than they lose, particularly with the schedule. But it's just, if you were kind of buying into the idea that Iowa could get to Indianapolis, I think that probably died on Saturday.
Agree with Dr. Tom. I don't think they're really all that sick there at Iowa. They just, like, they're coming back for their checkup. They haven't hit those fitness goals. And Iowa State played well. It's not like Iowa played all that poorly. Iowa State forced that imbalance of play calling in the second half by saying, all right, we got nothing else. We're just going to load up against the run and see if you can throw it. And Cade McNamara just can't throw to the level that you need to win those games against better teams. So Iowa's defense has to pitch a shutout. Iowa State is a pretty good quarterback. They have some real weapons on the outside. I mean, they probably have 3 or 4 better pass catchers than anybody Iowa has. And that was a stark difference there in the second half. Iowa does not have weapons or a difference-making quarterback. I think they can still win 8 ball games, but they're no longer in the SEC or in the Big Ten West. So the path to getting to Indianapolis for that Big Ten championship game is a lot harder now, because you don't have a cakewalk schedule, although their schedule is still kind of easy, as we see here on the TV.
Yeah, it definitely is. They're still like all these teams, it's still 2 weeks in the season. We had a really good half against Illinois State after sluggish one in the first. We had a good half against Iowa State. Like, the pass game looked a lot better. Cade McNamara started off hot. It was like, okay, here we go. This thing, they might put up 30 points. They might cover, they might hit the over all on their own. That was like kind of what you were looking at. Then they come out, they try to be aggressive. You make one really bad mistake trying to throw that little, trick pass back, across the field, and it's not there, and he tries to force it, and it's a horrible decision. And then your confidence is shot. All of a sudden, you start struggling. Then the play caller gets a little bit uptight, and you start figuring each other out. I think a lot of this in all of these like programs where we've got new starters, new coordinators, it takes time for that continuity to develop. Like, what plays does my quarterback like? What receiver am I going to go to? What's my go-to run play and short yardage? And I think all of us, myself included, probably the most, is like, oh, this is going to work. Like, Tim Lester's new West Coast offense is just going to work. It takes time. So that's where I'm not panicked yet. I do agree, like, Bud has been pretty hard on Cade McNamara. I saw that first game. I was like, man, he looks great. Like, he looks like he's healthy for the first time. He's got to make better decisions. Like, he's not somebody that's going to bring you from behind. He's not somebody, if they take away the run game, that's all of a sudden going to be, all right, we'll just air it out through the pass. So I do worry somewhat about the personnel, but I think we can all agree they're in a way better position than they were last year at quarterback. And so that kind of, I don't want to say give you hope, like, hey, it's not as bad, but I do think there's clearly a lot of room for improvement, and I would expect that to happen over the course of the season.
Yeah, and like, I don't know if I've got the exact prescription. I like the way that Dr. Bud said it with the fitness goals, because there were 2 times in that first half where Iowa had the ball inside the 5 and came away with chip shot field goals. If those field goals are touchdowns, or if they're able to convert on that 2-point conversion, like there's so many hidden points in that game that did not go the Hawkeyes' way. You feel as though you do a little bit better, just a little bit better, then that ends up being a win. So I agree, no huge panic, but I certainly can see where things went wrong. This is for the fast. We triaged everything. We got our 2 big dogs out of the way. Let's go into the quick clinic right now, the minute clinic, I guess. Dr. Bud, just coming to you on this one, because you have had a lot of interest in exactly where Maryland is, what their quality is, and Michigan State comes to town. Michigan State turns the ball over 3 times, shooting themselves in the foot, and yet Maryland just totally lets this one get away. Now, is this a bad sign of things to come for Mike Locksley, or do you think the Terps are going to be able to steady the ship?
Chip, I think that it could be, right? I was talking to Jeff Erman of Inside Maryland Sports, our great Maryland site on the 24/7 Sports Network, and Maryland's young defensive backs, they're just not there yet. And you saw Michigan State expose that. They threw for almost 400. Like, I know they had 3 interceptions, but they also allowed 3 touchdown passes. And Mike Locksley, I think, has to have greater trust in his offense. Billy Edwards is playing pretty well. The decision to kick the field goal there late was a negative EV decision. If you look at the charts, he should have had a little more trust in Billy Edwards. He kicked it, didn't work out, right? And so I think you got to trust what you're seeing. And right now, I think Maryland's offense might actually be better than its defense, and you need to lean on it a little more.
All right, and to you, Dr. Tom, I know that your sleep schedule was not benefited by this game going to overtime, and especially by the point total. But what went wrong for Northwestern to allow Duke to come into your practice field and walk out with the win?
I don't think you need me to tell you. I think the fact that they've already made the change at quarterback and they'll be replacing Mike Wright with Jack Lausch next week tells you everything that Northwestern feels needs to be fixed on their team, because that offense is just brutally bad.
All right. Well, we've got it. We've got the prescriptions filled. Go pick them up at your local pharmacy. Best of luck to Yes, Dr. Danny. Oh, Doctor.
I was going Spies Like Us reference. Doctor.
All right. We are closed. We will be back with you next week for more diagnosis. But coming up on the other side, we love to give you that cover 3 big game breakdown style. And we'll be looking at Camp Randall and Wisconsin playing host to Alabama. Keys to the game, what we're looking at, and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. One thing we like to do midweek, every week, both here on CBS Sports Network and on the podcast, which you can get wherever you get your podcast, is to take a deeper dive into these games. We'll give you our best bets, our picks on Thursday's Lock Show. But now it's time to really look at the matchups, the storylines, the implications of what might happen and what we are watching. So, as Alabama, which, had a game that was much closer than anyone expected, though it looks better on the scoreboard at the end, they beat USF. And they now show up for one of the bigger non-conference games of the entire schedule. They will be playing in Madison against Wisconsin. And so, Tom, you have been for much of this offseason the Wisconsin whisperer. You seem to have your finger on the pulse of at least what they think somewhere closer to the program. So, first attacking this from the Wisconsin side, they find themselves as double-digit underdogs of more than 2 touchdowns in this game. Where are the places where you think Wisconsin has a chance to be able to make this a little bit closer? Or if you don't think that at all, feel free to entertain us and tell us why.
Hold on, let me get my finger on the pulse of Wisconsin football here real quick. Oh man, it's faint. It is cheesy. It is not pumping very hard. Yeah, it is. It's scary. Wisconsin, the good news was last week against South Dakota, the offense did improve. The bad news is the offense is still bad. Like, if you look at what they have done through the first 2 weeks of the season, there has been very little explosiveness from this Badgers offense. They are currently ranked 133rd out of 134 teams in explosive play rate on offense at Tyler Van Dyke, to this point, the transfer quarterback, has come in. It's not working out. Even if you include the bad years that Tyler Van Dyke had at Miami, he averaged 8.1 yards per attempt with the Hurricanes. He's at 6.4 so far against Western Michigan and South Dakota. So it's not as if the Badgers are facing the most difficult competition out there. But at the same time, I don't want to put all the blame on Tyler Van Dyke because I don't think it's all his fault. I look at what Wisconsin currently has at the receiver spot. I don't see a lot of guys getting open. So as far as my feelings for what the Badgers are going to be dealing with in this game, I don't think Alabama's a great team. I don't think it's the same team we've seen in the last few years under Nick Saban, and definitely not the dynasty years. But I have a very difficult time thinking that the way this Badgers team has played through 2 games, they are going to look anything other than 2-touchdown underdogs at home to Alabama. I think we've got the second straight week in which an SEC team is going to come up north and beat the brakes off of a Big Ten school.
When you were talking about Tyler Van Dyke, it sounds kind of similar, right? We've got a quarterback on his 3rd school where they're trying to, second for Tyler Van Dyke, but they're trying to recapture some of the magic that he showed very early in his career. I'm thinking of DJU who had that moment against Notre Dame, and you saw flashes, and you're always hoping you can recapture some of that magic. And even, aside from his year, which he tore it up, his first year starting at Miami, you still had the Texas A&M game last year. Like, oh, that's the version, 5 touchdown passes. Where's that guy? It just feels like you're kind of wishing, similar to what Florida State's doing with DJU. Like, man, can we get that version? Tyler Van Dyke may just be what he is, and that's a pretty average quarterback, and that's a scary thought if you're Wisconsin trying to go against this Bama team.
Danny, the other thing is, if you go back to when Van Dyke was good at Miami, right? He was playing with a lot of tempo. That was with Rhett Lashley as the offensive coordinator. And Wisconsin under Phil Longo, their OC, has been a really fast team. In fact, last year I had them in top 20 in my tempo metrics. But this year, they're bottom half in the country. I think they're one of those teams where the helmet communications has caused them to slow down. And I think that's been to their detriment. I'm sure all coaches think, hey, more input is good. But I don't like what I've seen out of them so far with this reduced tempo. I think they need to go back to tempo if they have a shot of catching Alabama off guard, especially because Bama has 3 freshmen in their secondary, 2 redshirt and 1 true, and they have had some issues in the opening week. So I'm curious, like, does Wisconsin, do they fire up the tempo this week and really kind of show out something? Because this slow Wisconsin stuff, I don't like it with this offensive scheme at all.
Hey, Bud, what about Wisconsin's defense? Because Alabama against South Florida, there was some communication issues up front. Jalen Milroe kind of had to make things happen on the fly. We know that Ryan Williams is absolutely awesome, but I can't say that's a perfect unit either. How did the Badgers defense stack up against the Crimson Tide?
So, Chip, all offseason, I really hated this matchup for Wisconsin, mainly because I don't think their defensive line has big-time, like, future NFL pro players, which Bama certainly has a couple on the offensive line. And things got worse when one of their best defensive linemen was lost for the year in fall camp. But there's a but. Alabama has also lost some really important offensive linemen already. Caden Proctor was injured in warmups against Western Kentucky and was seated in a sling. We don't know if he's going to be able to play this week. Their right tackle, Elijah Pritchett, only played for the last couple snaps in that USF game because they were in danger of losing the game, and they had to put him back in because their backup right tackle, who's kind of the 4th best tackle on the team, I guess, because Proctor's also out, he was that guy was getting kind of smoked. So they have 2 injured tackles right now going into play in Camp Randall. So maybe Wisconsin's defensive weakness, which is clearly the defensive line, could be neutralized a little bit by Alabama's injuries.
And Danny, what about Jalen Milroe? Where would you grade how he has performed through 2 games based on your expectations of him going into the year?
Again, similar to the conversation we've had with a lot of quarterbacks that are in new systems, because he is learning Kalen DeBoer's new system. I don't think it's clicking yet for him. And I think you're seeing him rely on some of his athleticism. And there was a stretch in the second half of the South Florida game when there were either 5 or 6 straight 3-and-outs. And you saw Jalen Milroe kind of drop in a little bit of pressure, didn't know where to go with the ball, either took a sack, threw it away, or tried to run, and they were able to contain him. That's where I would think that Wisconsin has a chance, right? And you're talking about a 15.5-point underdog at home. How do they stay in this game? I think you cannot let Jalen Milroe beat you with his legs because he is an incredible athlete. We've seen him being able to do that. Some of their best plays this year have come when they've utilized him in the run game. And I do think Wisconsin's secondary may be a little bit underrated. I think they're decent enough against Jalen Milroe specifically, where I don't think he's just going to slice and dice you, maybe the way that quarterbacks in the past at Bama have, or Michael Penix did at Washington in a Kalen DeBoer offense. So even with the talent they have, and Ryan Williams out there who's been spectacular so far, just don't let Jalen Milroe kill you, because I don't think he's comfortable enough in this system yet where you can just, like, you're really terrified of getting beat through the air, but where you cannot let him get loose. Like if he goes off, and you could see those type of games unfolding, that's what you cannot allow to happen. But I'm very curious to see what Luke Fickell has in store for him defensively, because he's always had well-coached defenses. I think they'll be disciplined. I think they'll stay in their lanes, and they won't, give up contain and some of the things that they're supposed to do on the defense side of the ball. And that's how you would make a prescription for how Wisconsin would stay in this game.
Yeah, it's an interesting matchup to me, what this Alabama offense is going to look like going against this Wisconsin defense. Because, Bud, you mentioned Alabama is messed up on the offensive line. They're dealing with injuries. And overall, it's kind of shown in their performance. They've been very boomer bust on offense. Like, you look at the one side, they have the 44% success rate on offense, which is not great. It's about average, but typically for Alabama, you expect to see a team with that kind of talent doing much better. But as far as explosive play rate goes, they are 15th in the nation. So they're either getting nothing or they're getting huge chunk plays, which kind of plays into Jalen Milroe's entire vibe, considering he's much of a running quarterback who sometimes hits the deep shots in the passing game when they're there for him. But what concerns me is on the Wisconsin side, they're also going to be missing linebacker Jake Chaney for the first half of this game, who got hit with a targeting penalty in the second half against South Dakota. So he will be serving that suspension. He's a big part of that Wisconsin defense. So missing him for a half, Wisconsin could find itself in a hole early that I'm not sure their offense has the ability to dig out from. And then finally, like you mentioned, their secondary, Danny, I think Ricardo Hallman's a very good player. I think they have other good players in there. But this front seven that Wisconsin's dealing with is not quite up to par with the teams that we have seen in recent years as far as getting pressure on opposing quarterbacks. And it's showing because that secondary is having some problems. They currently have a 12.62 explosive play rate allowed so far this season, again, against Western Michigan and South Dakota. That ranks 95th. So a boom bust offense going up against a defense that's given up a lot of big plays doesn't feel like a great formula for the Badgers to me.
Yeah, explosive play rate against Western Michigan and South Dakota. That's not good. All right, what about our thoughts? What about our picks? What about our leans? Really quickly, let's go. Danny, Bud, Tom. Danny, what do you think? How do you think this ends up playing out?
I think Alabama's too much. I just think they'll probably lean on them. They'll try to establish the run. You're talking about the big plays. I think they'll get a couple of them. And I just don't know if I trust the Wisconsin offense to match that kind of firepower on offense. I worry about Tyler Van Dyke on this stage. So I don't love the Badgers here at home. Oh, is this our first mute button for Bud on national television? Is that the first one?
All right. Man, all this Alabama love, and over the summer I would have agreed, but they've looked quite disjointed so far. I don't know if I really trust this Alabama team to go on the road and win by margin. I do think they'll win. I think that Jalen Milroe will be the leading rusher in the game because Kalen DeBoer's history is that he leans on his studs. And the best thing Bama has going for them is Jalen Milroe's legs. But that secondary has been leaky. Against Western Kentucky, they had guys open, and the WKU quarterbacks didn't see it. Against USF, Barry Brown saw it. He just couldn't hit it, right? I think Van Dyke may be able to hit some of these wide open guys if Bama doesn't fix that leaky secondary. It's hard to blow somebody out and win by 3 scores if you're giving up bombs. So I kind of think Wisconsin may be able to cover here. We'll see.
I think if Wisconsin gets anybody open, they should celebrate because I haven't seen it at any point so far this year. I think Bama wins big.
Yeah, I got Bama big time too. We will have our eyes on it, certainly as it is the first big test for Wisconsin here in this 2024 season. Well, coming up on the other side, we thought Notre Dame didn't have a big test in week 2. Then Thomas Amick and Northern Illinois came and brought the fight to the Fighting Irish. Now they got to pick up the pieces, and they've got to go play a Purdue team that's been waiting for them. Big game breakdown for Notre Dame at Purdue. We'll get into all that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Very excited that game on CBS, America's Most Watched Network, the network of stars, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time kickoff will be Purdue playing host to Notre Dame. And look, last time we saw Purdue, Hudson Card went out there with that Cover 3 podcast bump. Nearly a perfect day in their opener against Indiana State. Then the Boilermakers have actually had a week off this past weekend, all getting ready for this big opportunity against Notre Dame. The Fighting Irish, of course, enter coming off of that loss to Northern Illinois, where, as the week has progressed, we are starting to wonder about the overall health of Riley Leonard. Reports indicating and a review of game footage showing a couple hits that he took that might have led to a reported injury for Riley Leonard. Bud, what's your feel in terms of how Riley's health might impact the way that Notre Dame plays in this game?
Chip, I think it's really the entire handicap of the game, to be frank. We talked about prior to the Texas A&M game just how much we love the fit of Riley Leonard with this offense because of his legs. This offensive line is extremely green. Remember, they lost their top 2 tackles to the NFL draft in the top 40 picks. Their heir apparent is already gone for the season. So the offensive line is rather suspect by Irish standards, right? And ultimately here, Leonard's escapability is some of the best in the country, but the injury is to his non-throwing shoulder reportedly. And that's a big deal to me because I don't really care about his throwing. It's not that good, but the running is really good. If he cannot run effectively, which we saw last week against Northern Illinois, where Notre Dame suffered what is probably the largest upset of the season as a 28.5 point favorite, then it does call into question whether he should be starting this game. And we'll see if he does start, and we'll see just how effective he can be and how long that leash is before they decide to go to backup Steve Angeli.
Yeah, I mean, this is an injury that everyone's going to be watching for to see exactly how Marcus Freeman handles this. Does he play or not? What'll be interesting is the conversation that, is going on with Riley Leonard and the medical staff. Like, what do you do for this injury? Is it something where it's a pain tolerance deal and you could say, hey, give me a shot so I can go out there and play? Or is it something where, no, you can't do that because you could get hurt much worse? Like there's an injury, where there's a chance where you could miss extended time because you hurt it worse. So that's the conversation that's having right now. I do think, and we were talking during the break about this, that Steve Angeli, he did have a pretty strong performance against Oregon State in the bowl game. And maybe it does force them to run more of an offense that's a little bit more traditional, but does maybe rely a little bit more on the bright sides we've seen at wide receiver. Greathouse has looked better. Bo Collins has looked better. Like all of a sudden, the receivers, which have been a point of concern for Notre Dame, also all of a sudden look a lot better. So maybe it's an opportunity for them to want to not rely so much on Riley Leonard and his legs and allow somebody to actually throw the football. Because this, it's funny because we did talk about another team. There are only 5 teams in all of college football that do not have a touchdown pass yet. Northwestern, we talked about at the beginning of the show, they're one. Notre Dame is one of the others, and it's the first time since 2007 that Notre Dame has not had a passing touchdown in the first 2 games of the season. So at some point, they need to be more balanced. Even if Riley Leonard is playing, it's the book is out. I know Bud likes talking about this, like just stop him running. Good luck, make him throw the football. So that's something to just keep an eye on. The story of this game is his health. How does he play if he does? Is he going to be able to throw? And then what if he can't play? Does Angeli actually give him a better passing game option?
It's funny you mentioned that 2007 season because that was the last time Purdue actually beat Notre Dame. Now, they don't play as often as they used to, but Notre Dame has an 8-game winning streak in this rivalry. And I do think that obviously the Riley Leonard situation plays a huge role. But I think if you're Notre Dame and you're coming off a home loss to Northern Illinois, you can't just keep going with the status quo unquestionably. You have to kind of wonder what you're doing and if maybe a change is better for you long term. So if Riley Leonard's banged up and you're not sure about him, maybe you do go with Angeli because, Danny, you mentioned one of the things that has stood out in these first 2 games of the season, even with the loss last week, is at the receiver position, Notre Dame looks more explosive. They look better than they had in recent years. And Riley Leonard is not exactly the best player to take advantage of that. But this is a matchup in which Notre Dame could possibly look to exploit because, listen, Purdue crushed Indiana State, and they should feel great about it. They've got the extra week to prepare for this game. but this is still not a Purdue team that I think any of us look at as a really strong, excellent team. And defensively, Ryan Walters loves to play man coverage. He loves to pressure the quarterbacks and leave his defensive backs on an island. So if you have the kind of talent that Notre Dame says it has and has shown flashes of at wide receiver, why not put a quarterback in there who can take advantage of those guys getting open against the secondary and maybe hit some big plays? So if I have any question about Riley Leonard's health and his ability to play in this game, I'm looking at it as an opportunity to see what I have behind him, to see if I could get this team to be a better football team, because I know you spent a lot of money getting Riley Leonard to come from Duke to Notre Dame, and I know there was a lot of hype around it, but you just lost at home to Northern Illinois, so maybe it wasn't the right decision.
Yeah, Tom, there are very few teams that I care about more and know less about here heading into week 3 than the Purdue Boilermakers, who just have an absolute pasting of Indiana State as the only data point that we have to be able to pin on them. Total mystery team to me right now. But if we are to try to, pin this and you're to make a prediction, Tom, how do you think this one ends up playing out?
I do think that Notre Dame should win this game, because we can look at it the one way and say, hey, a road game against a Power 4 team, Notre Dame's fine. It's at home against the G5 where they truly struggle. But I think that it's a lot closer than I would have anticipated a few weeks ago or even 8 days ago, because of the Riley Leonard injury and because of just Notre Dame losing to Northern Illinois. And I think if you look at Purdue, obviously, we don't look at a big win over Indiana State and say, oh, this team's great, they're back, they're going to be phenomenal. But they are feeling great about themselves, and they've had the extra week to prepare for this game. So they're coming into a home game extremely confident, looking at a Notre Dame team that just lost to Northern Illinois and saying they're vulnerable. There's blood in the water. They're smelling it. They're going to go get it. So I do think this is going to be a much closer game than I would have anticipated a couple days ago. I still think the Irish rally and get this one, because I do think defensively they will present a lot of challenges for this Purdue offense and keep them from putting too many points on the board. So I'm taking Notre Dame, but I'm not super confident in it.
I think Tom nailed this one, honestly. If you look at this, if you're a Notre Dame defender, you're looking around when you're watching film, you're saying, man, Riley's dinged up. We need to play really well. And honestly, Purdue has some real weapons. Hudson Card is playing well. Jamal Adrien, the receiver, is playing really well. Max Clair, who was hurt last year, the tight end, is playing really well. But do you know who was not playing real well against Indiana State, and Notre Dame is going to notice? 3 of the 5 starting offensive linemen for Purdue were graded at a 60.0 or below by PFF. If you are Notre Dame's defensive line, you smell blood in the water, right? Like, hey, we need to go out and dominate these guys, pressure Hudson Card all day, and we can do it. So I do think Notre Dame's defense will carry the day here. But like Tom said, it's hard to see this team winning by margin unless Purdue just gives it to them.
Yeah, and as bad as the Northern Illinois loss was, the defense, you hold them to 16 points, you should still win against Northern Illinois. That should be good enough to win. I know they were the physicality of it, the fact that they did get pushed around a little bit. Northern Illinois was able to get some tough yardage throughout those situations is concerning. But I do think this is where Notre Dame's defense picks up the slack. Not one, but 2 of my former teammates with the New York Giants sons anchor that defensive line. RJ Oben and Howard Cross III, a tight end for me. Both their sons forces on that defensive line. I think they'll step up. I think this is one where it's a pride game. You bounce back. I think they'll be fine. And I'm not completely sold. 24-25 sounds awesome, and it was for Hudson Card. That's hard to do in practice against air, but it practically was against air. This will be a totally different situation.
Disrespecting the Spoilermakers. Okay, I'll see y'all on Thursday. I'm just saying. Okay, coming up on the other side, we've got a couple of old rivalries that have been going on forever. And we thought conference realignment might mean we wouldn't get them, but we get them this week. New Big Ten members, Oregon, Washington, seeing some old familiar foes. We'll take a quick look at those rivalry games and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, we've got ourselves a pair of rivalries here in week 3. We will have, of course, Washington and Washington State renewing the Apple Cup the 116th time. Oregon and Oregon State as well. Let's begin with that Apple Cup, because if there's one person on this podcast who is intimately familiar with Washington State's offense, it is Mr. Bud Elliott, Dr. Bud Elliott, as we labeled him earlier. So, I mean, my one-liner for this one, Bud, like I wrote down 29 games I was interested in this week, kind of like a one-line for this one. And my one line for this is Washington State's offense for real? Can they have success? What is your expectation for the Cougars going into this game?
Chip, I expect the Cougars to win this ball game. I've watched both these teams quite a bit, and ultimately, I think John Mateer is playing extremely well. Now, I know Texas Tech had some turnovers and they had some important guys out on defense. I think Washington, their defense is probably better than what Texas Tech ran out there the other night in Pullman. But Washington State's offense is clicking at a really high level. I think their defense is playing, decently. Obviously, they did turn over Texas Tech like 5 or 6 times, which was rather insane. But I just don't know that Washington is ready to win this game right now. Maybe they are. I think Washington very well could be a better team by the end of the season. But like 21 of the 22 starters in Washington are new players. Like that's still a lot of clicking and gelling that needs to happen. Whereas Washington State had a lot more returning production and seems to be playing at just a slightly higher level, at least right now.
Danny, we were joined by Jed Fish at Big Ten Media Days. He called this, what do you call it, a reboot, not a rebuild. How do you think the reboot is going to look as now he takes on all of the passion and the hopes and dreams at home against a fierce rival in Washington State?
This one is spicy because of the added storylines of the Pac-2 versus the guys that got to go to the Big Ten, right? And they're, Washington, Oregon, they're in this new era of college football with the big TV contracts, better resources, and it feels like Washington State and Oregon State got left behind. So they're going to have a team that's coming in with a massive chip on their shoulder. And to Bud's point, Washington State has looked way cleaner. Washington has looked pretty solid, though, for a team that's starting, replacing all these players. I think you're getting exactly what you thought from Will Rogers, like a veteran guy who's thrown a billion footballs, it feels like, in the SEC, comes in here, gives them some experience. What I think is really interesting about this, that if Washington wants to have a year where they go bowling or they get to 7 or 8 wins, they have to make their hay early because the schedule does not get any easier on the back end, which brings even more importance to this one. But I do think, remember we asked him about bringing in Bill Belichick's son to run the defense. That's where I'm curious to see if there are any schemes to confuse Mateer, because he's been really good with the football. He's made great decisions. Can they throw some wrinkles at him to confuse him somewhat, potentially get some turnovers? That to me is one matchup to watch.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this game. I think I'm going to learn far more about both of these teams on Saturday than I've learned watching them through their first 2 games of the season, because Washington hasn't really played anybody to this point. And while Washington State's looked great and they did play Texas Tech last week, I have a sneaking suspicion that based on the fact Texas Tech barely got past Abilene Christian and then got smoked by the Cougs, that the Red Raiders just might not be a very good football team this year. So I think that coming into this one, a huge rivalry on its own. But then, Danny, as you mentioned, that kind of added spice to it of Washington State looking at Washington like, you abandoned us and left us behind to fight for ourselves. Like, I think this is going to be a fantastic game. I think that if you are Washington, if you're going to gel at any point, this would be a good time to do it, not just to keep that rivalry win, but to kind of give you some more momentum as you head into conference play where things are going to turn up a notch.
All right, so after 2 weeks of fighting the entire state of Idaho and dicing every potato there is in America, Oregon is going to play its rival, Oregon State. They got to go to Corvallis for this. Tom, are the Beavs the team that will bring out the best in the Ducks? Because I don't think we've seen it yet.
No, we 100% have not seen the best of the Ducks to this point. They were very, very mediocre in that opener against Idaho, and last week Boise State really pushed them to the brink. But the one question mark that we haven't answered yet is, What's Oregon going to look like when it has a healthy offensive line? Because it hasn't had a healthy offensive line in either of these first two games. They haven't been able to get explosive runs on the offense. They haven't been balanced like they were last year in that aspect. They've already allowed more sacks through two games than they did all of last season with Bo Nix. And Oregon State is coming off an impressive 21-0 win over San Diego State. But kind of like I was just mentioning with Washington State beating Texas Tech, I don't think San Diego State's a very good football team. And then if you go watch Oregon State's performance, even though they shut them out, it wasn't like the Beavers were putting on a clinic. So I look at this meeting. I think Oregon is going to win this game. I think they are better. And I think that even when they're not firing on all cylinders, they're probably going to be better than the Beavers over a 60-minute span. But that said, if they're still dealing with these injuries on the offensive line, that keeps them from being able to put teams away, which then means you're just one bad player, one unlucky bounce away from losing a game. So I can't completely write the Beavers off here.
I agree with Tom. I expect to see Dylan Gabriel have more confidence and just a better feel for this offense now that he is in his third game. It's still his first year in this system, but like the guy's old. I think he'll have some better experience here. I also think that Oregon found something offensively in that second half against Boise. Because of the injuries Tom had mentioned, they've been trying a lot of different combinations on the offensive line. A lot of those combinations didn't work, and they finally bit the bullet, and they moved their right guard to center, even though he may not know the calls as well as the walk-on they were playing there at center. But he can hold up physically. And you know what? It worked. Oregon's success rate went through the roof. I think they found something. I don't think the Oregon State body types are really comparable to the athletes that Oregon's running out there, so I think Oregon will roll in with ease.
Danny, quick word expectation. Ducks get right?
I think they do. I'm just worried about that defense because Aston Genty ran all over them. Oregon State's got a couple backs, been running the ball pretty hard. They better be ready to wrap up.
I love that. All right, coming up on the other side, we love to leave you with one player to watch. It's the Cover 3 Lockdown finale. We get into all that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. We always like to leave you with one player to watch. Danny Cannell, who you got your eyes on from the Big Ten for Week 3?
Oh, I need a big bounce back game from the Wolverines. And in order for that to happen, Donovan Edwards needs to step up. I mean, they got Arkansas State. You've got a player who's only got 19 carries and 68 yards on the season so far. And I get Texas was a tough opponent, but that includes Fresno State as well. He needs to go into Sharon Moore's office, needs to talk to the offensive line. He was supposed to be the featured back. Come on, Donovan Edwards. I need to see a big game out of him this weekend.
Great pick, Danny. I'm going to go out to Seattle. Give me Washington quarterback Will Rogers. I think Washington State wins the game, but if they don't, it's because this guy burns me, and he goes for 300, a couple touchdowns. The passing game is the best thing Washington has going. Will Rogers needs to carry Washington this weekend.
I'm going with the one man in the country with the 96% completion rate. I'm talking about Purdue quarterback Hudson Card. We touched on it earlier in the show. He was fantastic against Indiana State. Slightly more difficult test this week against Notre Dame, but I think Hudson Card is a good player, and I think he could put this offense on his back and maybe lead the Spoilermakers to an upset and become the first Purdue quarterback since Curtis Painter to beat the Fighting Irish.
Fire up your darts and heaters, fellas. I got my eyes on Coach Sig and that quarterback because Curtis Rourke has a chance to be able to keep Indiana's winning ways going. He's got to do a little bit with his legs, not too much, but certainly also spread the ball around to a bevy of wide receivers. I got Indiana quarterback Curtis Rourke going up against UCLA in Los Angeles as my player to watch. You can catch him in prime time. Well, if you want to catch us on the Cover 3 podcast, you can catch us Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, youtube.com/Cover3. You can download the Cover 3 podcast wherever you get your podcast. We go live on Saturday nights, 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And I don't know, last Instant Reaction Show ran for an hour 40. So just go ahead and go to sleep with us as well. And for Danny Cannell and Bud Elliott and Tom Finelli, I'm Chip Patterson. Gentlemen, thank you very much.